This is a Russian warship on fire in the Black Sea, and it was taken out by a country that Putin thought would collapse in 3 days. For decades, the world's military superpowers were the United States, Russia and China. And then the Ukraine war blew that order apart. Instead of collapsing, Ukraine is hitting targets deep inside Russia, sinking Putin warships and leading the world in drone warfare. And it's rattled the Kremlin. Ukraine isn't just surviving this war. In some key areas, it's overtaking Russia. So how did an underdog start seizing a superpower status? And why can't Putin stop it? I'm Simon Diggins, and this is Superpowers Exposed. Today we're breaking down 3 key fronts that show why Ukraine is starting to look like a military superpower and why it might even surpass Russia. First up, we're going to look at long-range attacks. And we're looking at the way Ukraine is taking the war deep inside Russian territory using a mixture of espionage, sabotage and drones. This footage shows some of the attacks on Russian strategic nuclear and bomber bases that took place in June 2025. The Ukrainians called it Operation Spiderweb. And the attacks were on bases as far away as a base ironically called Ukrainka in the far east of Russia, some 7,500 kilometers away from Kiev. And that, by the way, is a distance between London and Chicago. And also as far north as Murmansk, some 2,000 kilometers further north. And I'm just going to pause it here. The targets, as you can see here, were a mixture of their long-range bombers, which they've been using not to directly attack Ukraine. What they've been using them for is launching cruise missiles on them. And over 40 strategic aircraft were destroyed by them. And what this showed was the reach and ability of Ukraine deep inside Soviet Russia. And there was nothing they could do about it. The attack was achieved using a combination of espionage, obviously identifying the targets, and then by subterfuge. They moved the drones into Russia in a container, and then at one particular time, the container opened itself up, and then the drones then attacked the targets, as you can see here. This target here is of particular significance. What you can see here are aircraft known as Ilyushin 22s. And whilst they may not look like the sort of sexy bombers you see in the other bits of the aircraft here, these aircraft here are command and control aircraft. Sometimes they can be used for airborne early warning, but in this particular instance, these are Ilyushin 22 command and control aircraft. And the key thing about these aircraft is they control the battle space. And for the Russians, the ability to put together significant combined arms operations using aircraft, artillery, missiles, and ground forces is utterly reliant on these aircraft. But look at what the Ukrainians have been able to do to them. As you can see, the attack is directly onto the command and control dome, the radomes which are sitting on there. And by knocking these domes out and knocking these aircraft out, this would have affected what happens in terms of Russia's ability to control the operations significantly. It's probably more true to say attacking these domes and attacking these aircraft is more significant than attacking these fighter bomber aircraft you can see now in terms of the video. The significance of the attack is not just the damage it did to Russia's strategic forces, but actually just shows you the range and depth and sophistication of Ukraine's defence. From being very much on a back foot in February 22, they're now able to put together simultaneous operations against strategic bases in the north of Russia and the far east of Russia and elsewhere as well. It shows how much they managed to infiltrate and establish espionage positions, but also they can put together a sophisticated operation involving remotely controlled drones and everything that goes with that. I think this operation in June 2025 would really have rattled Putin, because he would be thinking, well, what's safe in his country? And the answer that the Ukrainians have come up with is nowhere is safe in Russia. We can reach out and touch you wherever you are. That is a really strong message for Putin, and one that will really have upset him. The ability to put together such a sophisticated combined operation involving sabotage, espionage, and then the destruction of strategic weapons is a real indicator of Ukraine's developing superpower status. Comparisons with countries like Israel and their ability to conduct such operations are not short of the position. And it's a very different place from where Ukraine was in February 22, when it was widely expected by many commentators, including in the West, that the armed forces of Ukraine, despite their spirit, despite their courage, would fail. But look where they are now, conducting this sort of operation across the breadth and width of Russia. What's particularly interesting about this attack was that the drone systems being used were not long-range attack drones. Now, clearly this operation is classified, but what we understand was that the Ukrainians used what are called quadcopters. These are small drones to attack these particular aircraft. And they were contained inside a normal shipping container with a false roof. And on a prearranged signal, the false roofs flew off, and these small quadcopter drones then took off and destroyed the aircraft you can see being attacked in front of you. Operation Spiderweb was not the only significant attack that the Ukrainians were able to carry out. This is a base attack in March 2025 against the Engels airbase. So over time, what they've been able to do is get more and more sophisticated in terms of what they're trying to do. Indeed, this particular attack may well have been done as a sort of preliminary attack in order to understand the techniques and procedures required to conduct the very sophisticated Operation Spiderweb. Again, this is a really good indication of the development of the thinking of the Ukrainian armed forces and their ability to use technology and all the sophisticated weapon systems that we are so used to operating in the West. It's a very marked contrast from what we all understood to be the situation with the Ukrainian armed forces in February 22. Now, what we've just seen is a very sophisticated attack against Russia's strategic bomber fleet. But the drones and drone warfare is very much part of the Ukrainian war. Indeed, we understand that something like 80% of all the destruction that's taken place in this war, perhaps on both sides, has been occurred through drones. Drones have been around for a while, and those of us who fought in places like Iraq and Afghanistan were well used to seeing drones being operating as well. But the sheer scale of drones being used in the Russian-Ukrainian war is something none of us could necessarily have envisaged. It's estimated that Ukraine used some 9,000 drones a day, 9,000 drones a day, but their production is keeping up with it. By the end of 2024, Ukraine was producing over 4 million drones a year. Drone warfare is very much a sign of what's not going on in the Russia-Ukrainian war, but also a sign of the sophistication and development of Ukraine's own armed forces. What we're now seeing is a sophisticated use of drones against very specific targets. What the Ukrainians and indeed the Russians have been able to do is combine technology that's now starting to be quite well developed with the very latest in terms of navigation and targeting systems. The Ukrainians themselves are very conscious that the Russians can try and jam their operations, but also that if required, the Americans, as indeed we've seen, can turn off some of the navigation systems itself. What we're seeing here is an attack on a tower block in Kazan, inside Russia. Now, it looks awful attacking a tower block, but in fact, this is a very precise attack on a very specific floor in this tower block, in which all Russia's elite forces were housed. Again, using espionage like the earlier attacks we saw with Operation Spiderweb, the Ukrainians identified the target and then used a very specific combination of the drone aircraft to attack them. So it's a pinpoint attack on this high-rise building, attacking very specific individuals in that building. And that's the joy and the value of this kind of drone warfare. What they're able to do is use precision attack against very specific targets. Here you can see the drone approaching the building and exploding. And indeed, we are told the residents were told to evacuate and get themselves into basements as quickly as possible after that. And you can see the scale of the damage it caused. But it was very precise damage indeed. This is one example of a particular type of attack by Ukrainian drones. But as I said earlier, drones are now very much a part of warfare across the whole. And 80% of the destruction of Russian equipment has occurred through drones themselves. The Ukrainians have been able to harness their technology, and really, and this is the really interesting development with this, also use a significant number of civilians in order to aid their effort. Indeed, they've got a whole unit who essentially are civilians, who both planned, organised, and then integrated their efforts with those of the Ukrainian armed forces in order to defeat the Russians as a whole. And they've also become more sophisticated as soldiers, also to the point whereby the units which are best at using the drones get the next best bit of equipment. So they're encouraged to get better and better, to innovate and find their way through. It's worth noting, of course, that this is also a competition. The Russians are also using drones, and there's been a cycle, a very sort of creative, destructive cycle, quite correctly termed, whereby each side develops drone technology, the other side tries to block it, and the side then develops a counter to that. And so we have this kind of creative proliferation throughout this war as things go forward. And that's very much part of the scene. Operationally, what Ukraine's been able to do is create a sort of zone defence in depth, making it extremely difficult for Russians to advance across their territory. They actually now call this the drone zone, and it stretches some 10 to 15 kilometres rearwards of the Russian front lines. And essentially within that drone zone, across the whole of the 1,000 kilometre front, it's almost impossible for Russians to move except on foot and at night. And even then, they can be targeted, but they're less vulnerable. What this means, it's almost impossible for the Russians to get together enough people to conduct an effective attack against the positions. The general rule, the kind of rule of thumb, if you like, in military operations, is it takes an attacking force needs to be at least 3 to 1 greater than a defending force. But because of the Russians' inability to move through this drone zone, which for them is a zone of death, it means it's almost impossible for them to make any significant progress, which is why we have seen across the whole front an advance which is slower even that of the Somme in 1916. And that is a remarkable change as well. And that's all down to drone warfare and the Ukrainian ability to make drone warfare their key defensive asset. We've looked now at long-range attacks and at drones as two of the key aspects of the way in which Ukraine is demonstrating that it's developing the superpower status. The third aspect is the control of the sea. And this should not be underestimated. Only the most sophisticated countries in the world can sensibly look at control of the sea. Think back to Britain and Britain's empire. All was entirely dependent on control of the sea. Strategically for Ukraine, the sea we're talking about is the Black Sea. And their ability to control or not to lose control of it is vital to their war effort. Russia attempted at the beginning of the war to strangle the Ukraine, and they used this by control of the Black Sea. They used it not only to try and support their land forces that were advancing along the Black Sea coast, but what they really were trying to do was stop Ukraine's grain export. Grain being one of the major exports that Ukraine has and a significant source of its income. And that's why the port and the access to the port of Odessa in particular, which is the western part of Ukraine, was so important to Ukraine and why Russia sought to destroy it. Now, what the Ukrainians have been able to do, which we're going to see now in this next video, is actually seize control of the Black Sea from them. This is extraordinarily sophisticated, using the most modern technology, but actually shows you the way in which Ukraine, again, is being able to look like a superpower and not just as a small European country. This footage, which is extraordinary footage, shows Ukrainian sea drones attacking Russian Shadow Fleet tankers. And of course, the Russians also need the Black Sea in their instance to try and export oil from Russia to boost their foreign reserves themselves. This particular attack involves naval drones. They've got various ones. They've got the Magura, the Sea Baby drones as well. And by attacking the Shadow Fleet, they were directly attacking Russia's ability to prosecute the war. Notice how low that these drones are operating. They just literally are skimming the surface of the sea itself. That makes them almost impossible to detect and very, very difficult to interdict. So even if they are seen by a ship, again, it's very difficult for the ship's crew or the defence of the crew to actually fight these particular drone operators as well. Now, these particular attacks took place just off the coast of Turkey. And interestingly, they took place just at the time when the Turks were offering to act as kind of intermediaries between the Russians and them. But the whole instance was, we are going to dominate the sea and we're going to stop the Russians from dominating the sea, attacking their shadow fleet and also by attacking their ships, keeping them away from the Ukraine and ensuring that Ukraine can get its grain exports out through the Black Sea itself. This particular video shows what it must have been like to be on board some of the tankers that were being attacked by the Ukrainian drones, but also shows you how difficult it is for them to try and resist what's going on. They cannot see the drones as they attack. They appear at wave height and then fly straight to the side of this massive tanker, and the tankers themselves then are highly vulnerable, exactly as you can see here. In addition to the film you've just seen, showing the attacks on the Russian tankers, The Ukrainians have also been directly attacking Russia's ability to conduct amphibious operations in the Black Sea. They sank a boat known as the Kaiser Kunikov, which is a landing ship, and earlier on in the war, they also attacked its two sister ships, as a net result of which the Russians were forced to move their main amphibious and naval units from out of their main Black Sea ports, which is in Crimea, which they attacked and occupied in 2014, further east, to keep them out of range of Ukrainian missiles and defences. And having moved the Russian fleet out of that way, they've kept them out of the way, keeping them well away from Ukraine and Ukraine's ability to dominate the Black Sea. I will just re-emphasise how important not only was the control of the Black Sea, but also how complicated it is to dominate sea operations. We in the UK, with our Royal Navy, have a 400-year tradition of being able to achieve such things, and we have no doubts whatsoever how complicated dominating the sea and sea space is. For the Ukrainians to manage this in a matter of years just shows how sophisticated and how well controlled their operations are. This really is a sign of superpower status. Yes, they're doing it differently from the way the British would do it, but their approach and what they're trying to achieve and how they've achieved it is remarkable. The question we posed right at the very beginning was whether or not Russia was going to be surpassed by Ukraine. And I would argue that potentially it is. And in a number of areas. One is their ability to generate forces, which is actually better at the moment than the Russians themselves. But I would say the key thing is their agility and their ability to be adaptive. Russia itself, while it has vast potential, vast resources, and a sophisticated defence industry, nonetheless seems incapable of adapting quickly to the changing battlefield conditions. And I think this is the key thing in terms of Ukraine's emergence as a military superpower, because what they've been able to do in the heat of battle, under massive pressure from the Russians, and even in the face of significant casualties, have nonetheless been able to adapt and innovate faced with that pressure. And I think that's also an indication of emerging superpower status. If you look back at history, and you look back at those times when different countries have dominated the world for a period of time, it's usually been when they have been at their most technically and technologically innovative. Ukraine is right on the cusp of that at the moment. And that's why I believe, and why I understand, that Ukraine may well emerge as Europe's military superpower. If you want a sense of the kind of spirit that motivates Ukraine, which has led them to this particular position, you can't do better than go right back to the beginning of the war, when President Zelensky, faced with what looked like a massive onslaught by Russia, was offered by America a way out. And he replied very bluntly, "I need ammo, not a ride."
Тому що наша зброя – це наша правда. Наша правда в тому, що це наша земля, наша країна, наші діти. І ми все це будемо захищати. Ось і все. Ось це і є те, що я хотів вам сказати. Слава Україні!
And that has set the tone for the way in which Ukraine has now dealt with this war. Of course, they're tired of the war. Of course, they want peace, but it's not going to be peace at any price. And even now, after 4 years of war and all their casualties, all the polling evidence suggests that Zelensky and the fight against Russia has the overwhelming support of the Ukrainian people. That is quite remarkable and something we should understand and commemorate. Ukraine isn't just surviving anymore. It's reshaping how modern wars are fought. Not in the future, but right now. The real question is, how far will this go?
Слава Україні! Героям слава!
What the Ukraine-Russia war has shown is yet again, of course, is that necessity is the mother of invention. But from this position, can Ukraine actually overtake Russia? Not just in the immediate future in terms of fighting this war, but sufficiently to prevent Russia from attacking in the future. Some of that's down to weapons and weapon systems, but the level of innovation and adaptation they'll be able to show, they all need to maintain in the future, because Russia will go back, lick its wounds, and try and look again to see whether they can take even more of Ukraine. And so Ukraine needs to keep that pressure up. And that's the real question. Can they keep that going into the future? I'd really like to know what you think in your comments, which I do read and we all read together. Please subscribe to Superpowers Exposed and let's continue the conversation on there. Thank you very much.